In this video lesson, we will talk about short-term fluctuations in a general domestic product and the business cycle. So we have covered what GDP is, what is the long-term economic growth, which means the increase in the real output over the long run. And now we are going to talk about short-run fluctuations. Generally, if you try to plot real GDP data, you will see a picture like this. So we can see that our GDP generally increases, grows with a rate of approximately 2-3% per year. However, this growth is not constant. During different times, during different years, economic growth can exceed this rate, and sometimes it drops below the trend. So our GDP fluctuates around this trend. And these fluctuations of the actual GDP around the trend do follow some pattern. They occur on a regular basis. And this particular pattern of fluctuations around the trend is called the business cycle. The business cycle has four main stages. The first stage is the boom, the top of the business cycle, the peak of the cycle where our GDP growth exceeds the trend. If we imagine that this is our trend line, GDP increases over time, in some periods it will grow quicker than normal, quicker than usual. Second stage of the business cycle is called recession or slowdown of economic activity, when our growth rate slows down, and eventually we can reach the third stage, which is called depression or slump or the trough, which is the bottom of the business cycle, when our economy is not growing at all or is actually in decline. And the final stage, the fourth stage of the business cycle, is when the economy starts to recovery or expansion, when we recover from this bottom and start to accelerate again. So generally, all these changes throughout the business cycle do follow a certain logic, and different macroeconomic variables will behave very differently during different stages of the business cycle. So for example, in a boom, output is very high. Obviously, economy is growing strongly. We produce much more than our norm. We produce above our normal capacity. This can take place temporarily. During this period, when economy is booming, consumer spending is high. Consumers are willing to borrow to finance their spending because they are confident about the future. They enjoy high production level, which translates into higher income. They have high disposable income, and as a result, consumption level is high. This also implies that firms are earning rather high profits because production level is high. Consumers are splashing out on their goods, so they're likely to face quite high demand for their products, and as a result, they're making lots of profits. And because of this, businesses which are encouraged by this strong demand, by additional demand for their products, are quite happy to expand. They invest a lot in order to satisfy this additional demand. Lots of new businesses will be created. So economy is booming. Because there is so high production level, so much economic activity taking place, unemployment level will be low. The economy requires lots of workers to support this extra production, which means that there will be very low unemployment. Everyone who is able and willing to work will be able to find a vacancy or start a new business, which also means that it can become harder for firms to recruit new workers, which means that they will be happy to increase the wages they pay, and as a result they can start putting upward pressure on prices. So during the boom periods, when our output is high, unemployment is low, we are likely to start suffering from inflation. Inflation is rising. So not everything which takes place in boom period is so good about the economy. We experience high growth, high production level, low unemployment. However, we suffer from high inflation. Let's try to represent these ideas in a graph. So this is our timeline, and our GDP will be plotted along vertical axis. And normally GDP grows with some rate, let's say 2-3% per year. However, during the actual periods, it can grow quicker or lower than our normal growth rate. So this will be long run trend. For example, growth of 2-3% per year. However, in a particular year, our output can be higher or lower than this. So, for example, when the economy is booming, during the boom periods, we will enjoy high output. We will achieve this objective, very high growth, high output, high employment, and therefore low unemployment. unemployment level. However, this will be achieved at the cost of high inflation. Inflation. Economy overheats during the boom periods. So not everything is so great during the boom. Let's move on. Second stage of the business cycle, recession. Recession implies a downturn in economic activity, which means that the rate of growth will begin to slow down. We are still growing, however, the rates of growth are slowing down, which means that there will be slightly lower demand compared to what we've just experienced before. Consumers will be less willing to borrow to finance their purchases because maybe their income started to decline. Many businesses will see a drop in sales and profits because the economy is slowing. Consumers are not buying as much as before, which means that some firms can start suffering from losses because of this lower demand. Maybe someone created a business at the top of the business cycle. They've enjoyed a constant demand for their products. They were unable to run their business effectively, and they were simply making money because the demand was so high. But now they're not as efficient as they should be, and as a result, they may start suffering from losses. Firms can start cutting down their production levels, and GDP growth slows down or can start actually declining, which also means that the firms will not hire additional workers anymore because they don't need to produce as much as previously, and as a result, unemployment will start to accelerate. Consumers' income will drop. Production level is low. There will be less overtime available. They might not be able to get maybe a second job. They will not be able to work overtime. Some of the consumers will not be able to work at all. They might lose their job if their company went bankrupt, and so on. And because consumer income drops, this will lead to even lower aggregate demand. Firms will keep cutting down their production, and so on. So our recession will gradually turn into depression or slump, the bottom of the business cycle. And maybe you've read in books, or maybe you saw some movies about the more severe or prolonged depression in the UK, which occurred in the 30s. It actually took place all over the world, in the UK, in America. It was called the Great Depression. This is the situation when economies lost about a third of the total production level. And we have actually experienced a similar depression in March, April this year due to the effects of pandemic, due to lockdowns. So many businesses were shut down that our output dropped by about a third, which was probably as severe as the Great Depression, but didn't last as long, because obviously it took place not due to macroeconomic factors, not due to macroeconomic events and shocks, but because of the pandemic. So the effects were temporary. So in depression, at the bottom of the business cycle, the aggregate demand will be at its lowest. There will be very low sales, and which means that companies will be making lowest possible profits or suffering from losses and just trying simply to survive. Firms cut down production levels and they get rid of any worker they can. They try to cut down on their costs, which means that unemployment will be at the highest possible level. No one is working, no one is hiring workers. It's really difficult to get a job in the middle of depression, which means that there will be lots of spare capacity in the economy. Our economy will be working within its PPF curve. We're definitely underproducing compared to our potential in depression. For companies, it will be very difficult to increase prices without losing any sales because consumers don't have any income. Firms are simply trying to survive, so they try to maintain at least some activity, and they're quite happy to cut down on their production, which actually implies that inflation will be relatively low because prices of everything go down. Unemployment is very high, which means that it will be easy to reduce the wages. It's very difficult to change the job, so workers will be forced to accept lower wages. And your suppliers will be in a similar situation, so you are likely to negotiate much lower prices for your raw materials because your suppliers are also willing to survive and also quite happy to give you discounts, which will put downward pressure on prices. So inflation in the economy will be relatively low. Unfortunately, many firms will go out of business and they will become bankrupt because they're unable to operate at these low prices. And it also means that investment level in the economy will be at its lowest. Firms will be unwilling to expand in this situation. There is no point creating additional capacity if no one is buying your available products. There will be very low investment level. So if we try to represent this on a graph, it will look like this. At the bottom of the cycle, if we operate somewhere here, if we are in depression, we are likely to suffer from very low output, which is obviously a negative thing. There will be very high unemployment level, so we don't achieve two of our main macroeconomic objectives. However, on the positive side, there will be low inflation. That's why I mentioned previously that these macroeconomic objectives contradict each other. So generally, not everything is good in the boom period and not everything is bad in depression at the bottom of the business cycle, because our economy will move in the opposite directions depending on which particular macroeconomic variable you are talking about. And of course, after every depression will come recovery. Economy gradually will start to recover from this huge decline in economic activity. This is when economy will start to pick up again, when it will start to experience the rise in economic activity. GDP growth will start to accelerate. Gradually, firms will start to increase their production levels. Eventually, they will start hiring new workers, and unemployment level, after certain lag, will start to decline. And because unemployment started to decrease now, people are able to find a job now, their income will start to increase. And when their income starts to go up, they will be able to increase their spending, which will create additional demand. When demand becomes stronger, firms will be encouraged to hire more workers, to produce more, to expand production, and so on. Now they will start lifting their prices because they can afford so, and inflation will start to accelerate again. As business confidence increases, investment level in a country will go up, output will increase, and unemployment will drop. So generally, this completes our cycle. This is what takes place during different stages of the business cycle. So it's very logical. There is a very clear link between different macroeconomic variables. How they change and how a change in one variable will cause an effect, a chain reaction, and it will affect all other macroeconomic variables. What you also need to know about short-term fluctuations is that governments often try to intervene in these situations to reduce the impact of the business cycle, and they try to lean against the wind. So they try to reduce the severity of these fluctuations. So they're trying to use monetary and fiscal policy in order to reduce the scale of these fluctuations. So what they will try to do is they will try to smooth out the effect of the business cycle. So this line with in gray will show the effect with government policy. So during the boom periods, in order to control high inflation, in order to tackle this, they will implement contractionary policy. For example, they will try to cut down on government expenditure, increase taxes, or increase interest rates to make borrowing more expensive. And they will try to do this in order to reduce aggregate demand, so that aggregate demand does not grow that quickly, so that inflation does not accelerate that much. And in depression, when economy needs some support, they will try to tackle these two factors, these two problems, with expansionary policy. In other words, they will try to support aggregate demand by increasing government expenditure, by reducing taxes to increase disposable income of population, by reducing interest rates. This is exactly what government and central bank are doing now. So, for example, interest rates at the moment are at the historically lowest possible level. And government and central bank are doing this in order to encourage additional aggregate demand, in order to increase aggregate demand and to support the economy. So this is what is stated here in the final slide. In boom periods, the government is likely to be worried about raising inflation, so it can reduce government spending, increase taxes, and increase interest rates in order to prevent the shift in aggregate demand to the right. And in recession, they will do the opposite. They are worried about unemployment, and they can stimulate aggregate demand by doing the opposite, to shift aggregate demand to the right or to the left. So we are simply using our graphs for aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which I've shown you already. So they will try to shift aggregate demand to the left or to the right in order to achieve their macroeconomic objectives, in order to tackle what worries them most. In boom periods, it will be high inflation, which is tackled by contractionary policy. And in depression, when output is low, they will try to support it by implementing expansionary policy. This is all you need to know for this particular topic. The final slide mentions the various causes of the business cycle, and generally it simply summarizes what we've covered already, that short-run variations in the aggregate demand cause the business cycle. So boom periods are associated with rapid increases in aggregate demand due to different changes in components of aggregate demand, and recession, the other way around, is associated with decline in aggregate demand. And sometimes business cycle can be caused by supply side shocks. For example, spillover effects from other countries. This is what took place in 2007 when there was a global recession due to the collapse of the housing market in America. So change in aggregate supply side shock, or changes in the world oil prices, wars, etc. Apart from this, business cycle can also be caused by delayed effect of past government intervention. For example, government implemented a certain policy last year, and it took a while in order for this policy to start and work. And as a result, aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve will start shifting to the right or to the left with some lag. And as a result, this delayed effect can cause changes to our aggregate demand and national output, inflation, and all other macroeconomic variables. So that's it for this particular subject for GDP. This is the reading which you need to do. And next week, next topic will be on inflation.